Welcome to Lesson 6. Today we are discussing Tennessee Williams and A Streetcar Named Desire. Now, because this is a play, I wouldn't mind you watching the version, especially the one adapted by Eli Kazan, starring Marlon Brando, so you're probably familiar with images from that, rather than reading it simply because this is how it was intended, right, to be viewed rather than to be read. Although, if you do decide to view the play rather than read it, you will be missing some of Williams's descriptions. Now, the author, Tennessee Williams, he was born in Columbus, Mississippi in 1911. He was born Thomas Lanier Williams, right? So Tennessee was a made-up name. And for the first 7 years of his childhood, he was raised by his grandparents, from his mother's side. Now this is significant because it is they who kind of instilled in him this nostalgia for the Old South and its modes of beings, and they taught him sort of to speak like a Southerner and act like a Southerner, or even more than that, like a proper Southerner. Now, his family moved to St. Louis, Missouri, when he was 7, and Williams was taunted there about his kind of Southern mannerisms by his peers. And he, because of this, grew even closer to his sister, and he kind of began his lifelong process of writing stories and poems to escape the ridicule of his colleagues, of the children that he was playing with, but also his father, who took to calling his son Miss Nancy because he thought that Williams was effeminate. Eventually, he suffered a breakdown in 1935 and retired to his grandparents' place to recover. And during this time, he produced his first play. Now, around that time, his sister's Rose psychiatric problems got worse. She was struggling with similar issues, and she had a breakdown, and she got put into an institute where her family, especially the mother, agreed to have a prefrontal lobotomy performed on their daughter. Now, what that cost, procedures or surgeries back then were pretty backward, and they were often very experimental. If you don't know what a lobotomy is, look it up on Wikipedia. But pretty barbaric. And basically, what resulted is that his sister remained with a kind of intellect and an outlook of a child for the rest of her life. Now, Williams felt guilty about this whole ordeal, and he kind of put the blame on himself that he wasn't around to stop his mother from allowing this lobotomy to happen. Now, I hope you're seeing some here, both in the sisters and Williams, this kind of building blocks for the character Blanche that we see in the story. Now, in his memoirs, Williams seems to relate to Blanche the most of all his characters, in studying his own nostalgias and kind of living on the edge between hope and paranoia as she does. So he himself even relates to that character the most. Now, as far as his education, he received a BA in English in 1938. He published his first story in a story in the magazine called Story, and later that same year, after lying about his age and name, he entered a contest. And in that contest, he won a group theater prize of $100, which obviously back then was quite a bit of money. He used this money to travel, visiting New Orleans, where this story is set, but also California, New Mexico, and Mexico itself. And ever since that time, he lied about his name being Tennessee, so this is how that basically his first name came to be, or his writing name at least. By 1940, he had moved to New York City, enrolled himself in an advanced playwriting class at the New School. Note that this is really the beginning of creative writing classes, which will be kind of fundamental and will have a major impact on postmodernist writings, which we'll discuss as well. Interestingly, critics considered Williams to be the most literary of American major dramatists. And by literary, they mean that they have kind of this descriptive sense, right? Most dramatists will just very dryly describe the actions and focus mostly on dialogue. But he is considered to be a true writer in that sense, that he, is not like O'Neill or Arthur Miller. With that training, he took odd jobs all over the country. He worked as a scriptwriter for MGM, and during that time worked on the play that would eventually be The Glass Menagerie. The play was a success mostly to the critical reaction, which kind of spurred theater goers and encouraged them to see the play. Soon after, he wrote his probably most famous play, The Streetcar Named Desire, and by 1960s his personal life deteriorated, right? So he saw a great success. He went from living very modestly, basically hand-to-mouth type of lifestyle, to what he describes as caviar and champagne, almost overnight. And as I've mentioned, 1960s, his personal life deteriorated. He spent years abusing drugs and alcohol, and eventually he converted to Catholicism. Though he recuperated from kind of his heavy abuse of the 60s decade, he never fully recovered from his addictions. And his work never saw the accolades of Streetcar Named Desire. Also, he claims that his conversion to his faith was for the benefit of his mother, so it wasn't a true conversion. Yet these kind of religious overtones remain in his work. After his death, there was a major movement of critics who redirected their attention to his newer plays, which were previously dismissed, and suggesting that those works may have been actually misjudged initially. So let's talk about this play, A Streetcar Named Desire. Originally, it was titled Blanche's Chair in the Moon. And as Williams wrote over the winter of 44 and 45, he kept toying with the idea of the title and kept changing and redrafting the material. And this continued well into 1947, so over a 3-year period. And this is significant also because we might look for signs of war weariness, right? If we are aware that a piece is created during the war era, World War II specifically. Perhaps we might also look if how the characters are placed and portrayed in that given time period. Now, he did live in Mexico during that time while working on Blanche's Chair in the Moon, which became again, he changed the title to The Poker Game, and then finally he settled on The Streetcar Named Desire. Now, this change of title, I think, is worthwhile to note because it suggests a kind of change of focus for William during his play, and we can therefore assume that both Blanche's avoidance of sunlight and the kind of low brownness of a card game will be featured at least as on the thematic level in the play. But also from the titles alone, we see Williams's ambivalence to the main character, to the protagonist. Now, once the play was finished, Williams wanted famous director Elie Kazan to help produce, to be the director. Now, Elie Kazan is an important name for us, even though he dealt specifically with theater and film, but He was this renowned director who really had a significant impact on American drama of that era. And when we're discussing Death of a Salesman, you'll hear of Eli again. He was instrumental in shaping this kind of new style of theater that emerged. And we in A Streetcar Named Desire, we have early symptoms of that. For example, we have instructions for a wall to become transparent, and for us to be able to view the street where we see a prostitute being almost raped by this drunk man, and then losing her wallet, and somebody going through her wallet, right? We see this from the Kowalski's apartment. So we have this kind of experimentation starting with displays. We'll see much more of it in The Death of a Salesman. But while working on The Streetcar Named Desire, Kazan demanded a great deal of control, so the director, and he left the artistic decisions almost exclusively to himself and Williams, rather than say the producers or the people who are putting out the money for the play's production. Now, Marlon Brando, who was in the original theater cast of this play, and his audition is definitely something of a legend. Williams had left for the Cape when he received this young actor from Kazan's famous actor studio. Eli Kazan ran an actor studio where he trained young actors. And he suggested that this man might be the perfect Kowalski. So Kazan gave Brandon $20 for bus fare to Princeton, and he sent him to basically read the script over at Williams's. Now Brando, instead of buying the bus fare, he kept the money for himself, and he hitchhiked all the way up to the Cape. When he arrived, he fixed the plumbing, he fixed the electricity in the place where Williams was staying, and he really astonished Tennessee. And he thought that Brando gave the best reading he had ever heard, and he was immediately calling Kazan to confirm his choice. Now, upon release, the critical reaction was very divided. Many thought that the play was offensive. Some thought that Blanche was a common prostitute. So this question of why would we want to focus on this sort of subject, these low lives, these prostitutes, these very morally exhausted individuals, why would we want to watch a play about them? This question is being raised by the critics of that time. In 1951, the film version was released, and you're viewing a screenshot from that version, the one directed by Eli Kazan, and it retained almost the entire original cast, except a new actress was cast in the role of Blanche. Now, Marlon Brando's method acting, so this new approach to basically feeling the emotions that you're portraying, it revolutionized the acting industry, and it changed the on-screen performances from these kind of stiff and kind of like these two-dimensional character performances to what we are more used to today. And after decades past, the shock value of the play it might have dissipated. We're more used to this kind of material that was viewed initially as uncomfortable, but the obsession with the characters has definitely not waned. And actually, at the Tennessee Williams Festival in New Orleans, men still gather annually to cry out for their Stellas, and we can certainly agree that this T-shirt and jeans anti-hero look was definitely popularized by Brando, and it still sticks as a pop culture icon today. Now, one thing to note about Streetcar, that in a sense it is a very un-American play. While most focus on the spirit of success and domination, his is a lament of a past civilization. The South is gone, and with it, the true American spirit. So what we're left with is Stanley Kowalski types. Now, the title itself, it singles, again, the importance of the metaphor in the work. And this is what critic Felicia Lauder says. She notes that it links both the concrete with the abstract. The streetcar, so the vehicle, and the desire, right? So the affect. And that it suggests the theme of a journey, both physical and emotional. It also suggests transience, as well as establishes a very specific locale. Now, the epigraph certainly speaks for a hurt lover who wants to recover from the loss of sensation, the loss of feelings. It suggests a desperate quest for love and its fleeting and love's fleeting nature again. And it certainly sets the emotional stage for the play. Now, whose voice could the epigraph be including? I mean, most certainly it reflects Blanche, right? The character who entered this broken world to trace the visionary company of love. So love for Blanche, who we'll discuss in further detail, is momentary, and it's born out of desperation, as are her attitudes towards various male characters in the play. But we could also agree that the quest, whether physical or metaphysical, right, it definitely drives both of the Dubois, or Dubois as it would be pronounced in English, sisters, right? So it drives both Blanche and Stella. So we could say that, the epigraph somehow refers not just to Blanche, but also to Stella, and in some ways to Stanley as well. We'll talk about that towards the end. Now, Williams always had the epigraphs to the play reprinted in the playbills, which the audience received. So this is not just a note in the play for the creators to read, but this was a frame of reference intended for the entire audience. Now, before we move on to the play itself, I want to back up and make sure we are clear on this issue of the South, right? So to understand Williams' nostalgia for the Southern way of life, we would have to go back to the Civil War. Now, this is the life, the proper way of being that his grandparents instilled in him, right? So the Civil War, the conflict, it caused the U.S. close to 1 million casualties. That meant that the war claimed lives of 10% of all Northern men and 30% of all Southern white men. So huge losses as far as manpower is concerned. Now, the South is often portrayed in the popular media today even as kind of vile, evil, backward, and this is mostly due to the fact that its economy prior to the Civil War was based on slavery. Certainly we can agree from today's perspective that this was one terrible thing about their society, but to empathize with this kind of antebellum period, meaning before the war, South, I think it helps to think of the people living there as being more similar mentality-wise to, say, the slave-owning Greeks or Romans rather than the modern man. Like slavery wasn't an unquestionable or wasn't something to question, and was basically seen as a natural order to their society. Plus, there were also, aside from this one major negative aspect, there were many positive aspects of their life as well. Now, prior to the war, South prided itself in being culturally superior to the North. And this was mostly due to the wealthy plantation owners who established themselves as sort of aristocrats, these educated, romantic, and powerful individuals. If we were to define the differences between the South and the North in a single word, we could say that the South was definitely chivalrous, and the North was pragmatic. And we definitely see this divide in the characters, especially in this confrontation between Blanche, who still believes in these tales of chivalry, and Stanley Kowalski, who definitely embodies the pragmatic approach. Um, Anyway, back to the difference. This is certainly probably how the South and North would like to have perceived themselves. The South as being chivalrous, North as pragmatic. Um, the South had established customs. They had a sense of decorum based on romantic ideals like courtship, like respect for the elders, and it was very separate. Their civilization or their culture was very separate from the urban and very cutthroat culture of the northern cities, which were full of these new immigrants from Europe, predominantly. Um, there was this idea of a Southern belle, which is also important to the Southern literature, and the poster girl version is pictured here on the right. Now, this notion of a Southern belle was a model for young girls from the plantation-based aristocracy to follow. So young girls were supposed to be attractive, flirtatious, witty, but also chaste and hospitable. They were expected to marry respectable young men, so not just anyone, especially not Northerners, and to dedicate themselves to their family, but more importantly, or as importantly, to their communities. They were supposed to partake in whatever affairs the community was going through. So in many ways, their role was more important than that of women in Northern society. So to keep this ideal kind of this Southern belle in mind is very, very important for our reading, because essentially it pertains to Blanche and Stella, except Stella has consciously abandoned this pretension in some sense, but Blanche does not want to stop being the Southern belle. Needless to say, after the Civil War, the dismantling of slavery, which was South's unquestionable pillar, caused the disintegration of Southern societal structures. It caused the degradation of the land's elite, and this is what Southern literature often laments. And we see the disintegration of the family of the Dubois or the Dubois, also mentioned in the play. Now, the story is set in a poor neighborhood in New Orleans. The Quarter is mentioned, referring to the French Quarter, right? So the old part of town. And even from the descriptions, we are told here that blacks and whites intermingle freely. Though this is, technically a southern city, Louisiana is very culturally distinct from the rest of the United States, or at least New Orleans is. So for our understanding of the story, it will suffice to know that both Stella and Blanche represent the dying class of America's cultured and refined upper class, which is being overrun by the industrious barbarians, quote unquote, of the working class that Stanley Kowalski represents. So this kind of new man, the new man of the factories. Now, as far as the structure is concerned, actress who played Blanche, Roxana Stewart, said that the first 4 scenes are comedy. Then the 2 next scenes that follow are elegy, mood, romance, and then the 5 final scenes of the play are tragedy. I think this is something good to keep in mind. Notice how the literary description of the settings that Williams uses to describe the poor sections of New Orleans, they definitely speak to a reader's imagination. Now, in keeping with the dualities that began in the epigraph, here this lyricism but also decay are side by side. Right? We're told that the river moves silently along the train, or silently along as the train rumbles down on the other side of the area. Right? So it is likely that a play's audience would have missed these auditory cues unless they were made very specific, or at least they would have not probably enjoyed them as much as someone imagining them. So the description seemed to work better for their imagination than the sound effects work in the theater. The opening scene with Stan bringing the bloodied meat, um, well, it's important to ask yourself the question, why do you think Williams opts for such an opening, rather than just, beginning with Blanche's arrival? After all, she is the main character. Well, chances are that he wanted to set up themes for characterization. Right? Stanley seems to be enacting some sort of primitive rite of bringing meat home to the family. But critics also notice that it underlines Stella's kind of titillation at her husband's kind of sexual prowess, so to speak. More importantly, we are again dealing with the idea how one Southern belle, Stella, gave up on her kind of refinement and all the high culture that she was brought up to kind of live up to, and embrace this sort of caveman brutality of the new man, right? So if her family saw her acting the way she acts here with this man, they probably would have been ashamed. Now the story is about the other sister, Blanche, and we will be watching her attempt to adjust to this kind of new reality, which is very harsh and very different from the one that she is used to. So Blanche, she is our protagonist. So therefore, let us start off with her name. First off, why do you think Williams opted for a name which means white in French? We most often obviously associate the color white with purity, but is Blanche a pure character? So is this kind of reference fitting for her? Well, probably not exactly, right? We know that she had a troubled life and that she had a history of seducing men, including younger men, 17-year-olds. They seem to be her weakness. So white could be, in that sense, as purity, be used as an ironic commentary on her, and this is something that she seems to be aware of, especially as far as her zodiac sign is concerned in the play. But returning to the idea of white, could white then therefore be referring to the white South, right? So the South of the plantation owners and its fading glory, which she represents. That's a possibility. But I think it's worth to note that colloquially, the term can be used to express this idea of whitewashing, right? Or presenting the uncomfortable truth in a way that will be more comfortable, right? So glossing, or even more bluntly, lying. Now consider this line, which I think is one of the more telling lines of her character. Blanche, in a sense, is saying that she prefers beautiful lies than the ugly truth, and she prefers to live in an illusionary world. And eventually, we know that that proves devastating to her. Now, Blanche's world is dying, and she herself is obviously incompatible with a new one. But unlike her sister, she can't figure out how to fit in. The old world of the Old South, right, which was dotted with these decrepit plantations and ancestral homes, further, I think, strengthens the argument that Blanche's name stands for whitewashing and illusion rather than any of the other mentioned. Now, recall that the name of their family estate is Belle Reve. Now, for those who are familiar with French, you'll note that Belle Reve is problematic in that it does not agree in gender. Right, so it could be either Belle Reve, as in a beautiful river, or Beau Rêve, beautiful dream. So this inaccuracy might suggest either A, the sophistication of Blanche's class is in large part kind of inflated and just a pretense, so they are not as sophisticated as they make themselves to be, or that they basically preferred illusions rather than accuracy. So basically they thought that Belle Reve sounded better than Beau Rêve, so they went with what sounded better. Now, we know that once Belle Reve fell into financial troubles, Blanche tried to save it by working. I think her job is significant to her characterization and what it allows Williams to do. First off, the fact that she worked as a school teacher reinforces some of the major contrasts between her and her antagonist, Stanley Kowalski, who is this kind of simple, lowbrow fellow. Now, the fact that she teaches English also gives Williams this opportunity to believably kind of instill her dialogue and monologues with lyricism, with literary allusions, with these metaphors which she uses and develops over time, and so on. Now, recall the way that Stanley speaks in contrast to her, right? It's his lines are usually clipped, they're very specific to the point, they're often reinforcing his interests in reality, in concrete things, in money, versus Blanche, who's always kind of seemed to be preferring illusions and allusions, as in allusions to works of art or works of literature. So, knowing all this, what can we make out of Williams's description of Blanche? Well, she is an aging beauty, right? Who, as Williams says, avoids a strong light, or should avoid a strong light. And he also likens her to a moth. So, what could this idea of light be symbolic of, right? So if she is a moth, then what is the light? So probably the same thing that Blanche is drawn to, and the thing that ultimately destroys her. Like, fire destroys moths that are drawn to it. Again, we have the reinforcement of the play's major theme, the destructive force of illusion. And the foreshadowing of the character's faith. And this is all before scene 1 even takes off. That at least is, the abstract idea of her being the moth and the light, symbolizing the illusions. Now, the concrete version of that would be, so what does actually destroy her in her life? What are her actual weaknesses? Well, we see that she likes to drink a lot and that she's sneaky about it, so she probably has problems with alcohol. And then the second thing that her second weakness is what we have discussed and mentioned already, is weakness for men, especially younger men. And they include Stanley Kowalski. Now, Williams' fondness for foreshadowing and symbolism seeps through everywhere we look. Even on this page, if we take a look at Blanche's dialogue, appropriately, right, it begins, so this is the one that's underlined in red. She describes how she got to the place where she is, and she says she began with desire, which foreshadows her kind of devastation with her husband and the lovers, and then leading to a kind of death, the cemeteries, and finally to an afterlife, right, the Elysian fields. So recall that in Greek mythology, the Elysian fields were the final resting place for the heroes. Another example of Williams' complex symbology is Blanche's sister named Stella. Likewise, Stella, referring to stars, is thus a likely reference. Now, could her being like a star be significant or signify something? So one critic, Norman Berlin, argues that Stella, as in star, is another part of Blanche's, or stands for another kind of part of Blanche's fascination, again, with light. A star, however, unlike Blanche's character, can inhabit both the world of dark and the world of light. This is what he writes. So, do you find such an explanation believable, or do you think this is a bit of a stretch of interpretation as far as Stella is concerned? Certainly there are these images from the play and the film that stands out, with Stanley looking up and calling out to Stella, almost as if he was calling out, to the stars. So perhaps that name could be used to help us interpret Stanley's character and the way he views Stella. But this, of course, could be misleading. Now, the first two scenes of the story reinforce definitely the difference between Stan and Blanche, and they help establish their antagonism. Right, the person who is perhaps most seriously threatened here in this confrontation is, however, Stella. She's caught, so to speak, between the hammer and the anvil, right? And she will try to soothe the conflict for as long as she can. The first thing she does is she tries to prepare her sister for meeting her husband, right? Asking her not to compare him to the men that they have dated back home. So, in other words, she realizes that Blanche will find Stan to be very much inferior to the southern men that they have dated. In scene 2, Stella tries to cool her husband's anger when he hears that her sister's old place had been lost, or that their place, the Belle Reve, had been lost. He assumes automatically that it was sold, right? So he focuses on the economic aspect of it, and he begins going through Blanche's things to find money. Or some sort of check or something that she received in exchange for the property. So one thing that's interesting is that we have his appraisals of the faux furs, of the rhinestones to be authentic, right? So he looks at them and he thinks that they are the real thing. Then later Blanche herself, towards the end of the play, admits that they're all fakes. However, this inability of Stan to kind of tell real beauty from artificial one is definitely telling of him. So what could we learn from about Stan just based on this one quality? Well, for one thing, we can understand this means basically that he is simple, that he's insensitive, that he's unartistic, that he's unlearned. Instead, because he doesn't care about this kind of lost dream of the Belle Reve, right? He only focuses on the money aspect of it that Blanche might have gotten for the property. This shows that he is, again, a very pragmatic man. Again, reinforcing the idea that he is the exact opposite of Blanche, a person who takes to wearing fake furs and diamonds to kind of maintain the illusion of her upper class, right? So the Belle Reve was an idea to her; it wasn't a physical place. But is Stan conscious of his own backwardness? Do you see that? Is he self-aware, or does he consider himself to be kind of on par with Blanche? This is another question to consider. Notice that he always wants to take things to an expert for appraisal, whether it be a jeweler or a lawyer. He always knows somebody who can appraise these items or situations in a way that that basically will be satisfactory to him. So, in other words, he realizes that he is undereducated. And at the same time, he's very pragmatic about this as well. He knows that there are people who specialize in appraisals, and he can trust their authority. When we finally get a confrontation between the two characters in the play, something interesting happens. Instead of open warfare, Blanche does something seemingly unexpected, right? She's acting flirtatiously, almost as if she wants to seduce her sister's husband. Now, do you think that this is her actual intent, to seduce her sister's husband? Well, most likely her intention is to wield her sexuality as a weapon to control Stanley. This is something that she has perfected, so to speak. But does she achieve this? Does she achieve her goal? Well, at least in this scene, it seems like she only frustrates Stanley and makes him even more aggressive. And knowing how the story ends, we could say that ultimately it turned out to be a bad idea. It turned out to be like playing with fire. When Stanley Kowalski finally forces Blanche to show him the papers regarding their lost property, the Belle Reve, we get this monologue. Right? Blanche launches into a speech about the loss of Belle Reve due to what she calls, quote, epic fornications of a generation of men from her family who eventually bankrupt the Dubois and lost the house. Thus we see who is to blame for the dilapidation, not of just their family, but also of the South, because the family is here in this play representative of aristocracy, of the Southern aristocracy, which is fading away. So I hope you find an irony here in Blanche's speech, because the question to ask, I suppose, is she better than her forebears? Or, on the other hand, does Stella seem to be better than them? You know, in some sense, both of the women are very much driven by libido and lust, and that leads to their ultimate degeneration. Even though Stella seems to love her husband, right, from a Southern perspective, again, bear this in mind, she has degraded herself socially by marrying this kind of animal instead of a gentleman, and what's worse, she takes his abuse and keeps returning to him. Now, we get some sense of hope for Blanche when she meets Mitch during the card game in scene 3. Stella tells her sister that Mitch is a good man and that he takes care of his mother who is ill. Now, there's some irony here because Blanche would likely would like to replace the mother, right? She realizes that because of her age, she does not need a passionate lover anymore. What she needs is someone who will take care of her in her old age, and Mitch seems to be the perfect person for that. Ultimately, the relationship fails. We'll discuss that a little bit later as well, but we see seeds of that failure here in this scene already. Notice that Blanche starts the relationship with white lies, right? She lies about being younger than Stella. She lies about coming over to New Orleans to take care of her sister, when in fact the exact opposite is true. Another question to consider is, how does Mitch fit into the game that's played between Blanche and Stanley during the card playing scene? Right, so the radio, I think, gives us a clue here. Why do you think Stanley responds with such hostility when Blanche turns on the radio, despite what the other men say, right? Remember that the other men are trying to cool him down. It's okay, let the girls have their music. So why is Stanley responding this way? Well, essentially, Blanche is undermining his authority, right? Stanley thinks of his apartment as his kingdom. He even says something to the point, and he wants things to be exactly the way he prefers. So Blanche is undermining his authority in his kingdom, but she is completely unfazed by this, right? And she challenges his authority again and again, which causes him eventually to throw the radio out of the window. Not only that, Blanche steals his friend Mitch from the game, and she manages to instigate a fight between him and his wife to the point where Stella runs out on Stanley. She's turning his world upside down, right? And she's successfully torpedoing his game night. But the relationship that Stan has with his wife is something that Blanche is unfamiliar with. Both his and her reaction surprises her. This is a famous scene from the movie and the play. First off, Stanley immediately knows where Stella has gone, right? When she has left him, he knows exactly where she is. This suggests that this has happened before, that this is routine for them. She's hiding upstairs, right, with Eunice. So what follows is probably the play's most famous scene. Stanley calls insistently for Stella. Eventually the woman is moved by his voice and she comes down the stairs back to join him. And when they come together on the stairs, the full degree of Stella's enthrallment with her husband is shown. Right, in the stage directions, Williams writes, they come together with low animal moans. He falls to his knees on the steps and presses his face to her belly, curved with maternity. Her eyes go blind with tenderness as she catches his head and raises him to level with her. So the suggestion here is that they are not acting rationally, but rather they are giving into their instinctual behavior. Remember this Freudian idea that shaped modernism. This Obviously, this action is incomprehensible to Blanche, who seems to view relationship with men as a game, or on the negative side, a game for dominance, where sex again is to be used as a weapon. On the positive aspect, as kind of this reenactment of chivalry. But here she sees her sister giving into her desires, so something that is supposed to be suppressed by well-mannered people, and seeing her sister being mesmerized by her husband's magneticism, and she lets him bear her to her apartment, thus kind of surrendering the upper hand to him. Scene 4 shows us the depth of Blanche's despair when she confronts her sister about returning to her abusive husband. Now, in the confrontation, she reveals her own attraction to him. She says, the only way to live with such a man is to go to bed with him, and that's your job, not mine. In other words, she tells her sister that that Stella is doing a poor job of using sex to manipulate her husband, or of keeping him in line, and suggests that she could do better. But Stella tells her why she puts up with all the abuse. Right? She says that there are some things that happen between men and women in the dark that make everything else seem unimportant. Right? So in a sense, she says that she desires her husband, and thus we have the title of our play. Right? And it's also a reference to Blanche's early line in the play, if you recall. So we know from her line that desire leads to the cemetery, and next we get off in the afterlife. The reference thus should serve as a sort of warning, as a foreshadowing. Blanche's answers her sister with her monologue. She calls Kowalski a brute, a primitive who knows nothing of art and poetry. But the question is she herself an aesthete? Or does she mean something else when she refers to like these new kinds of light? Now, arguably, this idea takes us back to the same things that Williams established about her character with the moth metaphor. So, what is what Blanche wants? Is it only a pretense of civility? Well, regardless of her motivation, her sister reacts to this monologue with a very definite answer. Now, please make sure that you know how she responds to this dialogue, okay? And we're skipping forward to scene 5, where Williams reveals the hypocrisy of Blanche's monologue against the epic fornications of her ancestors. So not the one that we just discussed, but the prior one. After Kowalski and the Hubels leave their apartment, a young man comes to the door collecting money for the newspaper, and Blanche begins to flirt with him. Now, this seems at first as her kind of natural way of being with men, but she begins making more and more advances, eventually reminding herself that she needs to keep her hands off children. She even kisses the boy. Now, this line is very telling because later on we find out that this is the reason why Blanche got actually dismissed from the school. It wasn't that she was tired. It was the fact that she was seducing, or at least seduced one 17-year-old boy. So in other words, she seems to be no better than her ancestors. She's basically letting her libido get the best of her. So in a sense, she's very much like her sister, and continuing, both of them continuing in the tradition of their family. So what caused Blanche to be this way? Well, we get the answer in her final confrontation and the breakup with the character Mitch, whom she is kind of dating throughout the play. She tells him of a man who she was in love with. They got married very young, and eventually she found out that he preferred the company of an older friend who happened also to be a man. Now, Alan, Blanche's husband, killed himself soon after she discovered this, and Blanche began to have affairs with many men, perhaps in an effort to kind of help reassert her sexual attractiveness or her appeal to men. Now, eventually, Stanley's investigation into Blanche's past forces her to admit the truth to Mitch. And when she tells him the truth, he breaks up with her, remarking that, quote, she isn't clean enough to bring home to his mother. Now, this confrontation with the truth, so the truth who Blanche actually is, right? She's not this well-mannered, high society aristocrat. She in a sense is a prostitute, destroys the illusion of the Southern Belle, right, that she maintained. And once the illusion is shattered, she unravels. Stanley takes advantage of this moment, right, and he rapes her. He thus defeats Blanche and gets her sent off to an asylum. Now, once the deed is done, Stanley is uncertain of how his wife will receive him. He calls out her name. Right, once Blanche is taken off by the doctor and the nurse, he calls out her name and then sits beside her on the stairs, murmuring words of comfort and wriggling his fingers into her blouse to again placate her with sex. Their marriage is still based only on that. The ending, because of this, is very ambiguous. We don't know how Stella will react to him. The question is, has Stanley actually won? Now, looking at the patterning of the play, the fact that the poker game is placed at both the beginning and the end of the play suggests that Stanley is the victor, right? His order of things is maintained. This is further insinuated by what Steve calls out right here in the very end, the very final line of the play. The game is 7-card stud, right? Stud as in referring to a female horse. So it tells the audience that ultimately the game is a man's game, right? The women who will play will not be able to win because men make the rules. Now, of course, this could be understood as connoting irony. Again, consider this. You know, in a sense, Williams' play plays into the Freudian notion that again shaped modernism, which we have discussed previously. So we see that all the characters give in to their instinctual desires, and this brings about their end if they are truthful about it, if they try to maintain appearances or deceive each other and themselves, as does Blanche. Now, it seems that Williams is suggesting that what destroyed Blanche is her inability to live without illusions, and she is unable to be truthful because she is ashamed of who she is. But here's the real question: are any of the other characters truthful with themselves? So, consider Stanley, right? He often speaks of the Napoleonic Code and his man's world, right, and owning, being the kind of the king of his place. Now, what pretense does he maintain? I'm not going to give you the answer. I want you to figure this out on your own. But also Stella, essentially, right, she chooses to stay with Stan in the end. And she does this by choosing to believe his version of the story, that he didn't rape his sister, right? So in a sense, she's choosing to believe him over her, over her sister. So do you think, the question is, do you think that she truly believes this? Or is she basically doing this to survive? Again, so I'll leave you with these questions, and we'll end it here.